Hi everyone, I hope you are doing well. So we're back. We're going to do another video. And this time we're going to talk about some crime. We're going to talk about this awful man, Dr. John Schneeberger. He's awful. I read this story and it's awful. There's going to definitely be a disclaimer for this video. Viewer discretion advised. Let's get into it. Kipling, Saskatchewan was a tiny Canadian farming town. If someone blinked while driving on Highway 48, they might just miss it. With only about 1,000 residents, life was slow, and pretty much everyone in town knew one another. On Halloween night in 1992, a 23-year-old single mother named Candace was finishing her shift at the only convenience store in the town. Candace had recently broken up with her boyfriend, Danny. Danny had stopped by to see her at work, but they'd gotten into a heated argument that escalated until she got so angry and upset that she sped off in her own car. So she left. Let's just stop right there. She left her own job because she got so mad, and instead of just making him leave, it's her job. I will not understand that at all. Candace couldn't think straight and decided to drive to Kipling Memorial Hospital to visit her friend that worked there. She arrived at the hospital to find that her friend wasn't working that night. However, the nurses on duty could tell she was distraught and suggested that she talk to the doctor. Dr. John Schneeberger was working the night shift. Dr. Schneeberger had moved to Canada from South Africa and was a well-respected member of the small community, even helping the town build a public swimming pool. The residents of Kipling considered themselves lucky to have such an educated and skilled doctor living in their tiny town. Candace also knew Dr. Schneeberger, as he had delivered her daughter earlier that year. Remember that part. She told the doctor about her anxiety, and he quickly suggested a sedative and then left the room. She expected a pill to calm her nerves, but was surprised when he returned to the examination room with a syringe filled with liquid. Immediately after she received the shot, Candace recalled falling back on the table like a piece of jelly. She tried to scream, but only a slow gurgling sound came from her mouth. Everything afterward was a blur. Candace was partially unconscious and only vaguely aware of what was going on, but she knew enough to tell that someone was pulling down her jeans and laying her on her side. She was facing the wall when she felt someone inside her. Completely under the effect of the sedative, she was paralyzed and could do nothing. Hours later, when Candace regained consciousness, she was still too dizzy to drive home, and the nurses working that night suggested she sleep it off in the hospital. The following morning, when she woke up with a clear head, she knew something was wrong. She confronted Dr. Schneeberger and asked what drug he had given her. His response gave her an uneasy feeling. He responded, "Why did it give you crazy dreams?" Candace knew she had been raped. Before leaving the hospital, she asked the nurses for an airtight plastic bag, put her panties in it, and then went home and immediately told her parents what had happened. Kipling was an extremely small town with only one hospital. The next afternoon, Candace drove to Regina, a slightly larger town about 95 miles away, to find a clinic that could perform a rape test. In the Regina clinic, Candace gave samples from her panties and jeans, and doctors took a vaginal swab to test for semen. As she suspected, the results of the test were positive. She knew without a doubt that she had indeed been raped. Before leaving, Candace asked to have her blood tested as well. The results showed that she had a drug called Versed in her system, a pre-anesthetic used to introduce anesthesia for procedures such as colonoscopies. She returned to Kipling and the following day filed a formal complaint with the Kipling Police Department. On November 2nd, Dr. Schneeberger volunteered to give a sample of his blood. However, he was adamant that he was innocent and that his blood DNA would not match the sample from Candace's rape kit. The doctor voluntarily gave a blood sample from his arm, and he was correct. It didn't match. After the DNA tested negative, Candace was in disbelief. She spent the next several months insisting to local police that the DNA had been somehow tampered with. Unfortunately, she had no way to prove it. She pressured the Kipling police for almost a year, and in August 1993, Dr. Schneeberger agreed to a voluntary second DNA test. This time, a registered nurse did the test, and police monitored the procedure. They watched as the needle entered his arm and the vials filled with blood. Officers then took the vials directly to police headquarters. Again, the second test did not match the DNA sample from Candace's panties. She was devastated. After 2 failed DNA tests, residents of the small town of Kipling were not kind to Candace. Dr. Schneeberger was their hero. He was a godsend in such a small town. The citizens of Kipling considered themselves lucky to have such a skilled doctor in their tiny town, whereas Candace was just a high school educated single mom. Thus, they rallied around the doctor and shunned Candace, believing she was somehow out for financial gain. In addition, some believed she'd had some sort of romantic interest in the doctor and wanted to harm him because he had rejected her. Residents were also suspicious of Candace because 2 nurses were on shift the night of her alleged rape, but she said nothing to them at the time. After the second DNA test and more ridicule from the townspeople, Candace moved from Kipling to Red Deer, Alberta, 9 hours away. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police closed the case in 1994, and Dr. Schneeberger continued with his practice and tried to get on with his life. In 1995, Candace was still reeling from disbelief that the DNA test didn't match. Out of ideas, she hired a private investigator named Larry O'Brien. O'Brien was a 25-year veteran of the RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who had done undercover and intelligence work in southern Ontario. Candace tasked him with obtaining yet another DNA sample, but this time in a more covert manner. On March 3, 1996, O'Brien broke into Dr. Schneeberger's car. Once inside his vehicle, O'Brien collected a hair sample from the car's headrest. Unfortunately, no roots were attached to the hair, meaning it had no usable DNA. However, he also found a slightly used tube of chapstick lip balm in the ashtray. The chapstick contained epithelial cells, which are skin cells, that can be used for DNA testing. O'Brien took the chapstick and rubbed it onto the plastic window of an envelope. He then bagged, timed, and initialed the sample and sent it in to the independent forensic lab in British Columbia. When the results came back, Candace was ecstatic. The DNA sample from the chapstick matched the DNA from her panties. She had been right all along. Armed with this new DNA evidence, Candace returned to Kipling and demanded that the police reopen the case. However, since she had obtained this DNA sample without a warrant, the police couldn't use it as evidence. There was also no guarantee that the DNA from the chapstick was actually Dr. Schneeberger's, so the police wouldn't reopen the case. Police, however, had their suspicions too, although they were apprehensive about charging him without hard evidence. Still, detectives believed in the science of DNA. Candace was completely baffled as to why the DNA from his arm didn't match the DNA from the panties and lip balm. So she filed a civil suit against Dr. Schneeberger and brought charges against him within the medical society. Again, with all the additional pressure, Dr. Schneeberger volunteered to have his blood taken a third time for another DNA test. This time, to ensure the integrity of the test, the procedure was performed in the police forensic lab and recorded on video. Not much blood is needed for a DNA test, so it was common for a sample to be taken from a simple pinprick on the finger. However, Dr. Schneeberger claimed he had a condition that caused him to bruise easily on his hands, so he requested that the sample be taken from his left arm. Since this was a voluntary test, and he gave the sample in good faith, the police complied with his request. On November 20th, 1996, inside a police lab, detectives videotaped as they drew the blood from Dr. Schneeberger's arm. But there were problems extracting the doctor's blood. Technician Jean Roney recalled the vein appeared larger than I would have expected, and I thought that was a little unusual. Sometimes when extracting blood from a patient, there can be an insufficient vacuum in the vein, which can cause difficulty getting the blood out. She eventually got a blood sample, but she noticed something strange. It's a little strange that the blood doesn't look really fresh. The lab attempted to test the blood anyway, but they eventually determined that it wasn't a large enough sample, and the blood had been too degraded for an accurate DNA test. Yet again, Candace was furious. However, just 5 months later, Candace would finally get a break. But unfortunately, that break came at a high cost. On the evening of April 25th, 1997, just as police were about to ask for a fourth DNA test, Dr. Schneeberger's wife, Lisa, contacted police and accused her husband of raping her 13-year-old daughter, his own stepdaughter. The young girl had come to her mother with the accusation and a condom wrapper she found in her bed. The young girl said her stepfather, Dr. Schneeberger, had been coming into her room in the middle of the night for years and injecting her with something that would leave her with fleeting memories of sexual incidents with the doctor. Lisa then searched her husband's home and office and found a box with condoms, syringes, and drugs, including Versed. She immediately called the police. Police didn't hesitate to arrest Dr. Schneeberger and order a warrant for a fourth DNA test. This test, however, was no longer voluntary, and the technician took 3 samples. Samples were taken from his hair via a saliva swab from his mouth and a blood sample from a finger on his right hand, not the left arm, from where they had taken all 3 of the previous tests. All 3 new samples matched the DNA from the chapstick and the semen in Candace's panties. Investigators officially charged Dr. Schneeberger with aggravated assault, which held a maximum penalty of life in prison. He was also charged with 2 counts of administering a noxious substance with a maximum sentence of life in prison, 1 count of obstruction of justice with a penalty of 10 years, and 1 count of sexual assault with a maximum penalty of 10 years. Dr. Schneeberger had thwarted police for 7 years, but detectives were still puzzled. The nurses, technicians, and police officers had seen the needle physically go into his arm each time. So, how did the DNA come up differently? During the trial in November 1999, the world discovered how. Dr. Schneeberger took the witness stand in his own defense and told the court that the first 3 times they drew blood, they were drawing someone else's blood. He had taken the blood of one of his male clients and inserted it into a thin rubber tube called a Penrose drain, along with an anticoagulant to keep it in a liquid state. He then performed surgery on himself. He implanted the tube into his own arm, just beside his own vein. Each time they had drawn blood, he had insisted on having it drawn from his left arm. Technicians had no idea they were drawing blood from a tube implanted under his skin. This is just crazy. They're getting so inventive of how to get away with crimes. I mean, this was pretty creative. You have to give it to him. I mean, he's not a good guy, but man, was he creative. During one of the videotapes, investigators later saw that he had always worn a long sleeve shirt and didn't pull the sleeves up far enough to see the incision in his upper arm. After watching the video more carefully, they saw the tube protruding from his arm for a split second. The new revelation explained why, on the third blood sample, the technician thought the blood looked dark and not fresh. He had removed the tube from his arm after the second test, stored it in a refrigerator, and then replaced it in his arm 4 years later for the third DNA test. I mean, that sample of blood is not going to be very good at all. However, even after explaining how he had faked 3 DNA tests, Dr. Schneeberger still claimed that none of what Candace said was true. His excuse was that he had put the tube of blood into his arm because it was the only way to defend himself, and he didn't trust the police. I mean, I don't trust the police either, but I'm not going as far as to do surgery on myself. I'm not doing it. Furthermore, he claimed that Candace had broken into his house and stolen a used condom from his trash to get the semen sample and frame him. Judge Ellen Gunn said his defense was inventive, fanciful, and imaginative, however, one that does not apply as credible, and called his theory preposterous. Of course, that defense was not near enough to convince a jury. Schneeberger was convicted of 2 counts of sexual assault, 1 count of administering a noxious substance to commit an indictable offense, and 1 count of obstructing justice. Amazingly, Dr. Schneeberger was sentenced to only 6 years in a minimum security prison. During Dr. Schneeberger's stay in prison, Lisa Schneeberger divorced him and fought with the legal system for the right to disallow him access to her daughters. For Lisa Schneeberger, her agony was just getting started. When Schneeberger was arrested, she had 4 children to support, one of which was only 13 months old. She sold the house and car to pay the bills, filed for divorce, and took back her maiden name of Dillman. On the evening before the jury gave his guilty verdict, Lisa refused to let the girls sleep over with him as he was required by the visitation agreement. She was ordered to pay a $2,000 fine for contempt of court. I mean, that's bullshit. She already don't have no money. She's got 4 kids to take care of. She had to sell everything just to try to pay bills and take care of kids. And this guy is not a good guy. It was proven that he raped that little girl too. What is going on with this justice system? You know, just saying. While in jail, John insisted on visitation rights, but Lisa kept fighting. Despite her attempts to persuade judges and politicians, the court ordered her to force the girls to visit him once a month. The man that had repeatedly drugged and raped their half-sister. When the day finally came of the first forced visitation at the Bowdoin institution where he was held, Nearly 100 protesters showed up at the gates to the prison and refused to let the car pass. Mad Mothers Against Pedophiles had organized a protest and claimed the courts were putting sex offenders' rights ahead of children's best interests. However, police eventually forced the crowds back, and the car carrying the girls entered the prison. Upon entering the prison, the girls, aged 5 and 6, were scared to death, crying and clinging to their mother's legs. A social worker eventually came to the rescue and called off the visitation. The win, however, was short-lived. Lisa eventually had to bring the girls to see their father on the last Sunday of every month. He eventually dropped his visitation request after realizing the girls had no interest in visiting him. In 2002, Bob Mills, a member of the Canadian Parliament, lobbied for a bill called Lisa's Law. It was an amendment to the Divorce Act to limit the rights of a child's access to sex offenders. However, the bill didn't pass. During the following months, Lisa continued to fight her now ex-husband. She assured the Canadian Immigration Department realized that he lied when he applied for citizenship by concealing information, his crimes, and making false representations. Schneeberger served only 4 of his 6-year sentence, much of it spent in Ferndale Prison in British Columbia, often referred to as Club Fed. Ferndale was a minimum security prison with residential-style housing, plenty of open spaces, and even a 9-hole golf course. Upon his release, Schneeberger was stripped of his medical license and Canadian citizenship and deported back to South Africa. He reportedly lives with his mother in Durban and works for a catering business. And that is the end of that horrific story about Dr. John Schneeberger. And honestly, if I find out what catering business he works for, I would never order from there. Now I'm leery about ordering from a catering business. You might get a rapist / pedophile. Never know. But anyways, what do you guys think of this gone awful story about Dr. John Schneeberger? I mean, he's awful. And then he didn't even really have a punishment. He got to go on a mini vacay and got released, and now he's living with his mom. I mean, hopefully his mom beats his ass every day. Who knows? Just saying. Anyways, on that note, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. And if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe. And as always, I appreciate you guys so much for watching. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.